Great. So I am really pleased to introduce our closing keynote for this SAIL conference, a symposium. It is Dr. Amy Abernethy, who I think has a lot to say to us, but in some ways it's intimidating in similar ways to the last talk because all her qualifications. She trained in medicine at Duke after having done her undergrad at Penn. She also got a PhD at University of Flinders. She was CMO, CSO at Flatiron. She essentially had a major principal deputy position at the FDA, where she was both acting CIO and running a bunch of regulatory programs, including those focused on AI. And now she's at Verily, leading a whole bunch of clinical essentially trials and studies like the baseline study, which are very much focused in ways that those of us who are interested in ML and AI are interested in hearing more about. So Amy, thank you very much for joining us, and well, sort of joining us. And Amy would have, if not for her daughter. And I do have to say that she's very busy, but like many people I respect, she puts family first, and there was an important event around her daughter. But I'm sorry she's not here, but I'm glad she was there with her daughter. So Amy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And hi, everybody. I'm confident that I have many friends and colleagues in the room. I can't see you right now, so I'm just imagining what you look like, including the pink sands of Bermuda. I am delighted to talk today with you. I have brought a colleague with me. Sometimes when you talk about tough things, you phone a friend. And I wanted to introduce why I asked you to come join us in this conversation today. So you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I'm Joe Franklin. Great to be here virtually with you all. I work on legal policy and regulatory issues at Verily, but I spent a long time before joining Verily recently at FDA, in part working with Amy, and we work together on many of the policy issues, including AI and ML, that around evidence generation, which we'll talk more about.
Terrific. Thank you, Joe. And one of the things I think is going to come through today is that, importantly, this is not going to be a talk about the answer to everything regulation of AI ML, but rather, hopefully, to present to you some frameworks, how to think about this. We are not here to give regulatory advice, so to speak, but rather to help give you some of the overarching context of why does this seem so confusing, because it is. And what might be some of the directions and way forward, and then what does this have to do with evidence generation, how we're thinking about it further. So that's the goal, and I asked Joe to join us because indeed it's confusing, and he helps me think about a lot of these things along the way. So I'm going to share the screen, get these pieces going. And Joe, if you can give a thumbs up if you can see my screen, that would be great. Fabulous. All right, friends. So what we're going to talk about is thinking through regulation of AI and healthcare now and into the future. As some disclosures, just want to remind you that I do work for Verily Life Sciences, and I lead the clinical research business line at Verily. I also sit on the board of directors of a drug company called EQRx, and so those are some relevant things for you to know about me. A little bit about Verily, just to make sure that I've anchored us in that part of the story. Verily really came out of Google X. It was the life sciences component of Google X, founded in 2013, and really has now grown up into a full and large company with 1,500 employees, focused in 4 critical areas. We have a clinical sciences business, which focuses on deep biologic data sets like immune profiling data. We have a healthcare delivery business run by Vivian Lee, who I believe is with you in the audience. We have a medical devices business. As an example, we make the device, the glucometer for Dexcom And then we have a business focus on clinical research, which is what I'm responsible for together with Joe and others. And we're really focused on precision health, bringing the promise of precision health to everyone every day and leveraging these different areas and capabilities to make that happen. And important for this conversation today is that AI and ML is embedded within the context of the products that we build at Verily. So for example, on Duo, we use AI and ML to improve the management of diabetes, also mental health and other chronic care illnesses. We have a whole team that joined us in Israel, and they're focused on applying AI and ML to detect colonic polyps and other elements within the surgical space. And we have a team who's using AI and ML to detect diabetic retinopathy and diabetic macular edema, and really focused on solving for leading causes of blindness worldwide. And so at Verily, this very much is kind of heart and soul of what we do in the conversations we're going to have today. Before I get going, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things about the regulation of medical devices. I'm an oncologist by background, as Zach mentioned, so sometimes it's hard for me to shift my mental model from the drugs and biologics space to the medical devices space, but there are a couple of fundamental differences in medical device regulation. The first is an understanding or a focus on this idea that medical devices can be classified according to risk. So this is inherently a risk-based regulatory approach. And as we think about low-risk devices, we might think about, for example, tongue depressors. So I know that the FDA regulates over 150,000 medical devices, and tongue depressors falls into that remit. And then there's high-risk devices. Think about needing to regulate, for example, cardiac stents when they first became something that might be used, and the importance of doing the safety and effectiveness evaluation in thoughtful ways. So the first is risk. The second thing that's unique about a device regulation is the understanding that in the engineering world, in the device world, devices continuously iteratively update. And so if there is a, for example, predicate on which now this is an iterative improvement, there's the mechanism called the 510K pathway that allows for iterative development. And then there's also opportunities at times for de novo 510Ks. So importantly, class-based risk evaluation and also ability to accommodate for updates across time. Now importantly, really first classified in 2014 through the International Medical Device Regulators Forum was this idea that there's an evolving landscape as software as a medical device. So this is not the software used to run a hardware medical device. So for example, this is not about the software used to run a pump that delivers IV fluids. This is actually the regulation of software and algorithms where that is the predominant product. So for example, it could be an algorithm that's an in vitro diagnostic. It could be general purpose algorithms that are intended to run on any kind of computing platform where the computing platform is not intended for medical use. Or these could be software products that are included in the context of other medical devices. And this landscape was really codified in an international document in 2014. And the US, and specifically the FDA, has worked hard to try and drive forward international standards in order to make sure that we're talking about the same thing around the world. So that's good from one side. So if you're an innovator or a device developer, being able to have consistent standards makes it easier for you to develop a product and commercialize it worldwide. It's difficult as we're talking about a space that's rapidly changing or evolving like AI ML. And in 2014, this was the SAMD risk categorization approach, acknowledging that the types of software for medical, software-based medical devices would be used in a variety of contexts, and those contexts could be classified to really allocate into 5 categories of risk. So the risk categories that you see here 4 categories of risk are classified as 1 through 4. And practically speaking, the way that we allocate that risk is by understanding if the state that the SAMD product is to be used is non-serious, serious, or critical, and that the kind of task that that product was going to be put in place for was to treat or diagnose. There's a higher risk tasks, drive clinical management, medium risk tasks, or informing clinical management. And so this was the approach outlined in 2014, and importantly at that time, IMDRF said we need to understand the performance, both clinical and analytical. We need to understand the inputs that are going to be used by the algorithm, and we really need to understand intended use. And one other thing to say about that is this, again, is a figure from 2014, thinking about, how might these different risk categories be aligned. And, practically speaking, this idea, for example, that type 1 devices might be intermediate risk when it informs serious illness is the way that this approach was intended to be applied. But 2014 was, frankly, 8 years ago and a long time ago in the context of the innovation we're seeing coming in front of us. In fact, we see this by the numbers. So between 1997 and 2015, there were less than 30 SAMD approvals or by FDA, and specifically this is looking at AI/ML-based approvals, which is a subset of SAMD. And just in 2020 alone, there was something like 100 individual approvals. This tells you that this space is rapidly shifting and things are moving along. It also means that, what was contemplated in 2014, really it was hard to imagine what the landscape would look like in 2014 and try and apply it today. It's also hard to imagine at times what is coming. So you're talking about a regulatory landscape that is indeed evolving and changing right in front of us. And if it feels like this is confusing to you, it is because when there is not terra firma, when it is still a space that really is under market shifts, it becomes hard to figure out exactly how one should regulate and what that should look like. Between 2017 and 2021, there's been a number of FDA-related actions put in place. So the first of these really happened in 2017 when Scott Gottlieb announced the plans around a pre-certification program. And the idea of the pre-certification program was to have a program with the intention of exploring third-party certification for lower risk digital health products that could be marketed without FDA pre-market review, and then also a mechanism for higher risk products that could be marketed after a streamlined FDA pre-market review. And the idea of this sort of pre-certification program was to pre-certify companies, and Verily it was actually one of them, along with Fitbit, Apple, and others, pre-certified companies essentially following good practices, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes, to be able to now get ready for the marketing of a variety of digital health products. In 2019, there was a proposed framework put forward for the regulation of AI/ML devices, and specifically in this framework, what was put forward was a discussion draft intended to ask the medical device community, the public, consumers, really for feedback on how to think through a number of issues as it related to appropriate regulatory frameworks. And in that plan specifically, it was described to consider a predetermined change control plan in pre-market submissions. So this was specifically to anticipate that SAMD products, especially AI/ML products, potentially could update across time. Algorithms get updated, and how would that indeed happen? This is a completely new way of thinking. The idea that there would be potentially a regulatory framework for products that get updated across time really is not contemplated in the device regulatory framework that came forth many decades ago. And the first SAMD-based evaluation leveraging a predetermined change control plan was in 2020. And this device, which was a cardiac ultrasound product, really incorporated a approach to now update the algorithms, anticipating that that would be something incorporated into the device. And finally, in 2021, so specifically in October, the AI ML-based software action plan was produced, which really, if you look at the document, largely answers questions that came forth from that proposed regulatory framework for 2019, and basically starts to put forth, and I'll give you some of the details in a second, how to think about the regulation of these products. Importantly, as we look across this landscape, so first of all, we're talking about only 4 years, it is heartening that there has been a pace of change over these 4 years. But really, when you think about the number of stakeholder engagements and feedback activities and legislative thinking, you can see how this is moving forth in what may feel like slowly from an AI ML community perspective, but actually quite swiftly in trying to accommodate for a new way of thinking given the products in front of us. But what you also see is what is truly missing is a change in law. So there's been a lot of activity, but really there has not been any significant change with the exception of proposals around clinical decision support, which came about as a byproduct of the 21st Century Cures Act. And so, in fact, because of the lack of change in law, you might have heard recently that the pre-certification programs largely fizzled out. We've learned a lot from that program, but otherwise, that really cannot persist because we don't currently have the legal regulatory frameworks to allow that to continue. So in the January 2021 AI/ML software action plan that was put forward, there are 4 key focus areas. The first is that we need a tailored regulatory framework, and that this acknowledges the fact that, again, products have different levels of risk, and we need to accommodate for the fact that products can really potentially get updated across time, and that is definitely different than was contemplated of the original devices multiple decades ago. The second is a focus on good machine learning practice, and I'll come back to that. The third is to acknowledge that we need a patient-centered approach to incorporating transparency into products. The fourth is, man, oh man, we need to continue to develop the regulatory science methods in order to give regulators the tools that they need to evaluate products. And then the fifth, which I'm going to talk about in more detail, is the importance of evaluating real-world performance of medical products. This is just a figure highlighting the approach for good machine learning practices. This was in that 2019 draft and is persisted in the 2021 follow-on, and really focuses on this idea of a clear set of practices about how data are going to be selected and models are going to be trained and validated, the importance of essentially assurance of safety and effectiveness and the right protocols to evaluate for that, and then also the appropriate approach to model monitoring across time. And key to this GMLP is to make sure that there's the appropriate organizational culture and controls in place to be able to ensure GMLP is happening, thoughtful approaches to evaluating the medical product in context, and then also thoughtful approaches for real performance monitoring. And I submit to you that over and over again, the real issue, and I'm sure this has been a conversation for the entire conference, is making sure that the data sets are available to do this work, both in model training and tuning and validation, but also in real performance monitoring across time, and that there is the reduction in bias. The other thing that's important about this figure is that not only do the data sets need to be generated and be able to be used in the production of your algorithms, regulators need to understand what you're working with and be able to review that. And they need the tools to be able to do that type of review at the agency, whether that's FDA or other regulators around the world, and also importantly, the capabilities to make sure that they can understand the data as well. This is specifically that approach that I mentioned before in terms of a pre-stated plan for changes to the algorithm. And this is what is outlined in the 2019 document in terms of a predetermined change control plan for an algorithm. And it highlights the importance of data. It highlights the importance of clarifying how the model is going to be updated across time. And very important, it highlights the importance of performance evaluation. And I submit to you that if you really want to understand this better, going back to that 2019 document will be quite helpful. Another thing that was highlighted was the importance of patients being able to use the medical product. I used this example that was in the 2021 document, as well as in the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee report, of the importance of understanding user experience, user design, and documenting how you got there. The play button is something that now culturally we all understand and can actually help an end user understand how to use a product. Perhaps you develop a different kind of play button. Making sure that it can be intuitive and understood is a critical issue. The other thing is many of our products actually get used not only by the patient, but perhaps by parents. So we can imagine, for example, a end-to-end diabetes management system with a glucometer and also with the ability to embed an algorithm for administering insulin. And having parents understand how to use such a device becomes particularly important. I also mentioned that the one place where we have seen legislative change is in the context of clinical decision software functions. And this is a summary table of the regulatory framework for CDS that came out last year. And I want to highlight a couple of things. The first is that the word draft is through the side of this figure. And that's because this is draft guidance. Remember, I highlighted that really it's only been 4 or 5 years that all this work is happening. Yes, the IMDRF started in 2014, but there's been a lot of changes over a short period of time. And so, indeed, when the draft guidance comes out, then there are community comments from all of us as a stakeholder community, and also, for example, from clinicians, health systems, and others, and that's going to be used to update such a guidance. So, importantly, keeping track of which guidance is draft and what the finalized guidance is important, and also going back to what is actually really the overall point. And then when you have a question, asking the FDA, ask your regulator. So in the case of clinical decision support, what you see here is in this risk-based approach, first of all, a distinction can whether or not a clinical decision support tool be independently reviewed in terms of the recommendations it is making, and that's a key feature. And then the other is who's the intended user, a healthcare provider or a patient and caregiver. And then what you can see here is that there are a number of different contexts for how that product is going to be regulated. And importantly, I won't get into any of the individual distinctions, but my kind of meta point is that this is a space that's changing, that actually CDS is the only place where we have true legislation that's pushing things forward at the moment. And so legislation is going to be pretty critical as we continue to move forward. And then the third point is that consult the guidance, consult your regulator, and make sure that you understand it for the basis of your specific product. Kind of one last comment before we start talking more about evaluation of performance. And that's that when Joe and I were at FDA, one of the things that was clear to us is that the space of AI ML is rapidly advancing. And FDA is going to need the tools and capabilities to keep up with this shift. And so as a result, in 2019 and 2021, we put forth the Data and Technology Modernization Action Plans to really make sure that the FDA had the tooling, the cloud forward infrastructure, and the ability to think about, leverage, and use data in ways that now can start to keep pace with what's going on in the communities of products that FDA regulates. And I'm proud to say this is a space that's continuing to move forward. We learned a ton of lessons in COVID, not the least of which was through the Evidence Accelerator, we learned the importance of putting regulators right next to medical product developers, people who hold data, people who are using those products like health systems and researchers, to be able to constantly ask the question, what is working, what is not? What do regulators trust, what don't they? And I submit to you that this is going to be an important model of continuing to create that cauldron of activity and regulators saying, here's where I'm concerned and here's where I'm not, in order to push this space forward. And it's also important for stakeholders to engage in a variety of different ways. And so we're now seeing different community and other stakeholder groups starting to put together not only treatises on here's how we're thinking about this product, but also now really summaries that help each of us understand what the FDA and regulators around the world are thinking. So the last couple minutes, what I want to get into is this idea of real-world performance of AI and ML-based algorithms, or real-world performance of SAMD. Importantly, as products have the potential to shift over time, we're going to need to think about the building of data sets and evaluation frameworks, EVGen frameworks, to accommodate for this. Traditionally, we think about a pretty formulaic approach to clinical evidence generation. Traditional phase 1 through 4 clinical trials, and that story had already started to shift in the context of devices over the last 5 or 6 years. What we've heard from Jeff Shern, the head of CDRH, which is the Devices Center at FDA, is that they expect continuous evaluation across the life cycle of the medical device. That's certainly an expectation as we start to think about AI ML-based products. That means that yes, we can have traditional clinical trials, but traditional clinical trials that may happen before the regulatory clearance or approval now need to be partnered with the continuous evaluation of the product across time to understand better how it's performing, to understand better whether or not there are specific populations to which the device is better suited or not suited, and also to make sure that clinicians and payers also have the kind of information that they need. If this is true, it's inherently longitudinal. And at Verily, we've been thinking a lot about this idea that we need to start generating the data sets of tomorrow to start evaluating medical products across their lifetime. In order to do that, we need to think about how are we generating longitudinal data sets that organize data in ways that, yes, have formalized clinical trial periods, but now also append data that may have come before, such as environmental health data, with data that may come after. So for example, you might imagine evaluating an algorithm-based device in a formal trial or in some formal study during a period of time, but now leveraging real-world data, such as information in the EHR or information coming from the device to evaluate its performance across time. And Verily, we're building towards this by building a series of steps, and we can talk about this more, but just to highlight what I think some of those steps are we need to build software that allows for essentially building platforms of data that are longitudinal and can be used to evaluate devices. And right now, we build software both for the conduct of clinical research, like e-consent and patient-reported outcome software, as well as software for clinical trial sites. We're working on building longitudinal data sets that combine clinical trials data and real-world data, and then we're really preparing ourselves now for the future, where what we're thinking about is what are the study designs of the future. The study design of the future that I want to highlight is now the ability to start to imagine digital therapeutics and other devices that need to be evaluated across their life cycle. And one example is we're working together with Otsuka and others to evaluate their digital therapeutic used in the context of major depressive disorder. And we are also on another program looking at the evaluation of a sleep apnea device that incorporates a series of algorithms. The idea being to develop longitudinal evidence generation programs that start to evaluate these devices across their life cycle, and really thinking about the formalized clinical trial plus longitudinal data sets that allow that to happen. The last thing I'll mention is that we're also starting to think about this not just in the context of one particular device, but whole populations. In particular, right now, we're working on building heart failure and heart valve registries that start to follow populations of people, combining prospectively collected data such as information from PROs and case report forms with data coming in from the electronic health record, from sensors that might be in a watch, and other data sets to now create longitudinal registries of people with different types of heart failure and valvular heart disease that then really provide the framework for continuous evaluation of heart failure-based products, such as remote patient monitoring products for heart failure, or valvular heart disease products, such as devices for valvular heart disease. And this is where I think it goes. Get the data sets right, prepare for longitudinal evaluation of performance across time, and then what we do is we set up the platform or the strategy that aligns with how AI and ML-based products are going to need to be regulated now and into the future. So I submit to you that the last thing I really wanted to highlight is that there is this importance in the change of evidence generation itself that goes along with the change in available medical products like AI and ML devices, and we're going to see these changes happening in lockstep. And it sometimes gets confusing, where are we, what's going on? But I think that over time, as many of these different elements get worked out, it will become easier to sort out. In the meantime, if you have a specific medical product, consult your agency, and the FDA has a specific email address, and happy to take phone calls, and then also watch this space as the regulations evolve. So with that, I will stop and take questions. And importantly, I try to leave some time at the end for questions, but also invite my colleague Joe Franklin to join, because
Joe wants to make some comments before we go to questions. Sorry about that, Joe.
He's on mute.
Okay, no comments from Joe. We can go ahead and go to questions, Zach. Sorry,
All right. How about from our audience while we're waiting for online questions? Anybody have a question from our audience? Yes.
Yes, Nicholas Tadnetti, Columbia University. Amy, thank you for a fantastic talk. That was wonderful. It's nice to get some insight from both your experience at the FDA and at Verily. One thing I noticed that was maybe absent from this talk, and maybe, I don't know like how relevant it is going forward, but was a discussion of how different algorithms may perform in diverse populations, in minoritized populations. And I'm wondering if on the horizon that is going to start playing a bigger role in how the FDA or companies are evaluating their algorithms.
You're muted. Amy, we're not hearing you.
wait, it's Zach, it's not her.
It's not her? Sorry, Amy. We're having a sound issue. Hang in there.
okay, I'm gonna try again.
Now we're good. Now we're good.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So that is a really important question, and I'm going to start, and then I'll hand it over to Joe as well. You know, I think that there have been a number of studies, as well as just increasing stakeholder and consumer expectation that we need to get this right with respect to bias. And so studies have demonstrated the criticality of understanding bias and recognizing it in our algorithms. And I anticipate that this is going to show up on the regulatory side in a couple of ways. First of all, continued scrutiny on the data sets that have been used to generate algorithms, as well as continued scrutiny of understanding performance of algorithms across time, including in diverse populations. And so that's one way I think that this will show up. And then I think another way that you're likely going to see increased concern show up is an increased expectation that there are diverse populations incorporated in data sets up front. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that's not more of a drumbeat going forward. The last thing is my point around FDA needing tools. So FDA needs the tools to be able to understand the data sets themselves and the risk of bias, as well as the tools to understand algorithmic performance across time. And I think that's going to be something that we're going to see an increased focus on. Joe, kind of thoughts from your perspective, how do you think this might change?
Well, I think Amy mentioned some of the regulatory, the regulatory use cases as we think of them for better evidence around the performance of AI tools in diverse populations. And I think that there are really important considerations that FDA needs to think about. And as Amy mentioned, I think there's a potential need for rethinking the legislative framework for at least these software tools governing the regulation. I know that the talk is about regulation. I just wanted to focus on one related area, which is in a lot of ways complementary to what FDA thinks about, and that's coverage and payment. I think that's, if you think about performance across populations and for products that are intended for Medicare beneficiaries, we know that Medicare is increasingly interested in how products perform in the real world for beneficiaries. So while developers of these products need to be thinking about FDA and regulatory considerations in this area, I think it's also critical to think about payment and coverage considerations and the likelihood, in my view, that we're going to be seeing at least proposals to incorporate evidence generation requirements, including the types of requirements that would show whether a product is working or not across diverse populations as a component of coverage and payment decisions by Medicare, at least. So there are many things to think about. It's a very important area.
Yes, question over there.
Hi.
Identify yourself. Yeah.
Hi, Stephen Hart from Mayo Clinic. So I'm going to go onto the theme of the confusion. Earlier today, we had a talk from Yale Gartner about some of the things that they were doing with the Apple Watch. And the question and the confusion arises, well, what exactly falls under the FDA purview as a medical device, because that's collecting data that should be, or that may be used in a clinical context. And yet the biggest piece of software in any hospital is the electronic healthcare record, which causes lots and lots of deaths and problems, which is not regulated by the FDA. So I'm just wondering what makes AI so special?
Oh, so important. I'll start and then kind of move over to Joe. So, two issues, and Joe can kind of really expand on these. One is around intended use and sort of the criticality of thinking about intended use, and another one is around the role in the essentially the diagnosis and improvement of health and healthcare. So I think those are two kind of critical elements. And Joe, any comments on those, and also any comments on the issue of the EHR and its regulation by FDA or not?
Yeah, well, I think that, so we talk about device, Amy talked quite a bit about evolving device regulatory framework and proposals for thinking differently about that, including the AIML thinking white paper and so forth, as well as the pre-cert program at FDA. All of that is based on the assumption that the product we're talking about is a device and meets the device definition in the law, which dates back many decades. I think that critically a device, whether a function is a device or not is based on the intended use of the device. And that's the distinction we see between That's the distinction that FDA has to make, or that developers have to evaluate when they're thinking about different functions, potentially of the same overall software tool. So I don't know if this is an answer to the question. Happy to talk more about this, but I think that it emphasizes the point, which is that it emphasizes the need for continuing evolution in the legal requirements in this space, because not only do we need to make sure that the framework, that the pathways allow for continuous evolution and oversight over the life cycle of the product, we also need to make sure that there are clear enough lines about what is regulated and what is not regulated by FDA.
Joe, could you give us an online question?
Yes, we have. Is this on? People hear me? Oh, okay, there we go. Yeah, so we have one question from the audience online, and that is from Juan Sebastian Osorio. And Juan asks the question, as I understand it, the FDA provides clearance of software as a medical device without necessarily real-world data performance. What if during that phase 4 process we found that the software as a medical device is not performing well due to bias, diverse populations, et cetera? So I think what are the future steps if that's found?
Great question.
That's a great one.
Right. I mean, I think of this as how do we connect up the pipes from the evidence generation efforts to the regulatory decision making. And a lot of that involves, as we get better data sets that are longitudinal, continuously accumulating data, FDA has to have the tools to act on that data in a discrete way, in a way that's actually practical for the reviewers at FDA. And you can think about a number of potential tools. I think labeling for these products to make sure that the practitioners understand the data that's being used to inform the algorithm. That's obviously something that's critical, and that can be enhanced over time with continuous evidence generation. And I think the performance can be reflected in the labeling, but ultimately FDA needs teeth. And I think FDA has authority for regulated products, or in the device context, related to recalls and other types of actions that FDA can take. I think we need to make sure that FDA has the right tools that are tuned to these types of products. I think it's a conversation that we're in right now.
And I think part of what you're getting at, Joe, is most practically, the adjustment in labeling would be, the most practical, set of steps. Because, adjustment in labeling isn't specifically just making sure that the wording changes, but actually an adjustment in the indication for how that product can be used based on new evidence that's come up in this post-market review. But then also the ability then to, for example, pull back a device or a product if it's not performing at all, or if it's demonstrated to be unsafe, or if so demonstrated to be unsafe. And one of the things we're seeing right now play out is that as the public gets progressively more worried that the ability to pull back on things is hard and not being not necessarily happening, there likely is, my expectation is it's likely we will start to see essentially more regulatory teeth on the post-market side of the equation, but that's still a space in development.
All right.
Thank you.
Mike.
Michael Abramov. I want to make a remark about the link to CMS that was mentioned, I think, by Joe, that right now CMS is very careful, and especially PFS, about reimbursing AI, and specifically autonomous AI, and they really care about very strict regulatory oversight from FDA. And so if we start to relax that, CMS may actually become more nervous, take away reimbursement, and that would be very detrimental to the future of AI, at least on the PFS side. I mean, there's NTAP and other things, but right now we're in a very unique position where there is safe AI that CMS is comfortable with, and you don't want too much of AI that is maybe a little bit more questionable, in my view.
Yeah, I think the interplay there is a really important thing to watch between the regulatory and coverage and payment side on the federal side in the U.S. and around the world.
Yeah.
And just to, kind of give voice to one thing that it feels like a little bit of the elephant in the room, is that the device space has had a fairly long history of continuously updating the product, continuously updating the indications as devices evolve, and that certainly now being sped up in the SAMD space. But now we're also seeing the longitudinal evaluation of drugs and biologics, and so there is a convergence happening in sort of that thinking of continuous evaluation across the life cycle of the product. It goes along with your point, which is that as there is increased concern from the payer side of like what else needs to happen, we're seeing now in the drugs and biologics space, obviously kind of the poster child being the Aduhelm decision, that there is now sort of increasing expectation potentially on the payer side. Who knows how that really is going to play out? And I think that this is, an interesting space for all of us to watch, but there are kind of some interesting parallels and convergences happening here.
I actually have a quick question from your vantage point at Verily. Unlike the FDA basically only has to worry about the United States, but Verily may actually have some products that are developed in other countries. And I'm just wondering, what regulatory things do you have to worry about when you have a machine learning product that was developed in Germany or China and think about it being applied to healthcare in the United States?
I'll start, and then Joe, I'll turn this one over to you, because this is like such an important topic. When we think about the development of medical products, the development of medical products may happen somewhere else. So we mentioned, for example, our team in Haifa, right? And the informing data sets may not represent, people from the U.S., right? So it may not be representative of our populations. And so we have a responsibility to make sure that we cross-check representativeness and also cross-check performance really with a worldwide lens. That's part one. Part two is that, practically speaking, as we've been thinking about the development of the longitudinal data sets needed to evaluate medical products across time, we've been thinking about that with an international lens, because we think that really being able to understand performance across different populations is going to be a real important task in the same way we think about that for international clinical trials. Joe, any comments here?
Yeah, I'll make a quick comment. I think there's two big, everybody listening to this is, I'm sure, thinking about this in different ways or ways that are related to your work. But the international lens is so critical, and it's extremely important to realize, and certainly we do, that the US requirements are only one thing to think about. And I honestly think that in the AI/ML context, in the software as a medical device context, and in the evidence generation context, we have a double challenge, which is that there's the traditional framework in pretty much every country out there that medical products are regulated, typically on their intended use, because they're intended to treat, devices or software functions intended to treat, diagnose, or mitigate, prevent disease. And then increasingly, we see requirements that apply to the data, especially sensitive forms of data like healthcare data. There's a great article this morning in the New York Times that kind of lays out the evolving landscape of data requirements and regulation and import-export limitations on data. So these are dual areas that make it doubly important to have a smart international strategy for anybody in this field.
Thanks. I was hoping you were going to bring up the data issue, which you did. Great. Any more questions from our audience? Joe, any questions from the online audience? Nope. In that case, Amy and Joe, thank you so much. You've been wonderful. Really appreciate your attendance and your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.